Westfield Academy, 2002. Look at Archer, designer shoes but can't even afford lunch. The jeering voice cut through the rain-soaked schoolyard, each word striking like a physical blow. 15-year-old Elliot Archer stood frozen, water streaming. Down his face, partly rain and partly unwelcome tears he refused to acknowledge. His empty lunch container hung limply from his fingers, evidence of his carefully constructed lie crumbling around him. James Harrington circled him like a predator, his expensive uniform perfectly tailored, untouched by the second-hand alterations that Elliot's overworked nurse mother had painstakingly sewn late into the night. Maybe we should start a charity, James sneered, his followers laughing on cue. Feed Poor Elliot, the scholarship charity case. The secret Elliot had guarded so desperately was now exposed to the entire prestigious Westfield Academy. He was broke. His father's business had collapsed into bankruptcy 3 months ago, leaving the family scraping by on his mother's hospital salary. The designer shoes, his one remaining possession from better days, were now instruments of his torture. Your dad's a failure, James said, his voice dropping lower as he leaned in close. Everyone knows it. And now everyone knows you're just pretending to belong here. Something crystallized inside Elliot at that moment, hardened in the acid, bath of humiliation. His fingers tightened around the empty container until his knuckles turned white. I will never, he whispered, so quietly that James had to lean even closer, ever be in this position again. James laughed, not understanding that he had just witnessed the birth of something formidable. What position? Hungry and pathetic? Elliot's eyes lifted, suddenly dry, suddenly cold. No. Vulnerable. Manhattan, 2025. Mr. Archer, the board is waiting. The voice of his assistant Marcus pulled Elliot from the memory that still had the power to straighten his spine and harden his resolve 23 years later. He adjusted his custom Tom Ford suit and surveyed the Manhattan skyline from his corner office in Archer Tower, a view he owned, along with most of the buildings visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. At 38, Elliot Archer had transformed himself into what financial papers called the executioner, the ruthless CEO whose acquisitions were surgical, precise, and often merciless. His handsome features, once the target of schoolyard taunts, now graced business magazines and sparked fear in boardrooms across the country. The Sunset Cafe acquisition. Where do we stand? Elliot asked, his voice carrying the calm authority that preceded his most cutthroat decisions. Marcus consulted his tablet. The owner still refuses the buyout, says the cafe has been in her family for generations. He hesitated. She's the last holdout in the block development project. Elliot's jaw tightened. Sentiment and business were incompatible. The first lesson he'd learned watching his father's company collapse. Increase the offer by 10%. Final attempt. If she refuses... His eyes hardened. Proceed with Plan B. Yes, sir. Marcus nodded, knowing that Plan B meant leveraging city regulations and property taxes to force the owner into an impossible position. Tactics that had earned Elliot his fearsome reputation. As Elliot strode toward the boardroom, his expensive shoes silent on the marble floor, he couldn't know that fate was about to play its hand. Tomorrow, in a small, struggling cafe in downtown Manhattan, the armor he'd spent decades forging would meet the one thing his billions couldn't control. A woman with nothing to lose, and everything to teach him about what real strength looked like. The boy who'd once stood hungry in the rain had become a man who hungered for nothing. Or so he believed. But life was about to serve him a different kind of nourishment altogether, one that no amount of money could buy. Sunset Cafe, downtown Manhattan. The morning rush at Sunset Cafe was in full swing, and Lucia Morales was everywhere at once, brewing espresso, taking orders, and somehow managing to remember that Mr. Peterson liked his muffin warmed exactly 45 seconds, and Mrs. Chen needed her tea steeped for precisely 3 minutes. 1 caramel latte with oat milk coming right up, Lucia called out cheerfully, her dark curls escaping from a messy bun as she moved with practiced efficiency behind the counter. At 29, she possessed the kind of infectious warmth that made even the most hardened New Yorkers smile despite themselves. "You're a miracle worker, Lucia," sighed Danny, her best friend and only employee, as she struggled to keep up with the pastry orders. "How are you still smiling? I know you were up until 2 a.m. doing the books." Lucia's smile dimmed slightly as she steamed milk. "Let's just say the books and I are no longer on speaking terms." The truth, which she hadn't shared even with Danny, was far worse than accounting frustrations. Last night, she'd received yet another letter threatening eviction if they couldn't meet the suddenly increased property taxes. The mysterious corporation that had been buying up buildings on their block was circling Sunset Cafe like a shark scenting blood. "This place is all I have left of her," Lucia whispered to herself, glancing at the faded photo of her grandmother that hung behind the counter. Elena Morales had built this cafe from nothing after immigrating with nothing but determination and family recipes. 3 generations of Morales women had poured their hearts into these walls. The morning rush finally slowed, and Lucia collapsed onto a stool, calculating for the 100th time how to make ends meet. Her business degree gathered dust as she struggled to keep her grandmother's legacy alive, working 3 jobs just to make payments on the cafe's mounting debts. The bell above the door jingled, and Lucia automatically plastered on her professional smile. "Welcome to Sunset." The words died in her throat. The man who entered wasn't one of her regulars. In an immaculately tailored suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, he stood out in the modest cafe like a wolf among house pets. His sharp features were vaguely familiar, though Lucia couldn't place him. "Is the owner available?" His deep voice was clipped, authoritative. Before Lucia could respond, the door jingled again. Her stomach dropped as she recognized Brock Warner, her ex-boyfriend and the reason she'd needed to take out a high-interest loan last year. He swaggered in, followed by 2 of his finance bros. "Well, if it isn't Little Miss Failed Business Major," Brock announced loudly, examining the cafe. With exaggerated disdain. "Still playing coffee shop with Grandma's recipes?" Lucia's cheeks burned, but she kept her voice level. "What do you want, Brock? We're busy." He snorted, glancing meaningfully at the now empty cafe. "Yeah, I can see that. Thriving business." He leaned across the counter. "I heard you're about to lose this dump. Should have taken my advice and sold when you had the chance." The suited stranger had turned, watching the interaction with narrowed eyes. "Get out," Lucia said quietly to Brock. "Is that any way to treat paying customers?" Brock's friend jeered. "Though I guess beggars can't be choosers. How many extension requests have you filed on those loans now, Lucia?" 4, another friend chimed in. "My cousin works at Eastern Bank. Says this place is weeks away from foreclosure." Lucia felt as if the air had been sucked from the room. Her private financial struggles, aired like dirty laundry in front of a stranger. Humiliation burned through her veins. "Maybe you could start a GoFundMe," Brock suggested with mock sympathy. "Save the sad little cafe that nobody cares about?" Enough. The single word, spoken with quiet authority, silenced the room. The suited stranger stepped forward, and suddenly Lucia recognized him from countless business magazines and news reports. Elliot Archer, the billionaire developer, the executioner. Her heart plummeted. So this was the shark who'd been circling her cafe. Archer's cold gaze fixed on Brock. "You. Outside. Now." Something in his tone made Brock's smug expression falter. "Look, man, we're just having a conversation." "A conversation requires 2 willing participants. This," Archer gestured between Brock and a mortified Lucia, "is harassment, and you're doing it in my presence." "Your presence?" Brock scoffed, though he'd taken a step back. "Who do you think you are?" A dangerous smile appeared on Archer's face. "Someone who owns the company that owns the company that owns the hedge fund where, If I'm not mistaken, you're a mid-level analyst hoping for a promotion next quarter. The color drained from Brock's face. Brock Warner, correct? Eastern Financial Partners? Archer continued conversationally, checking his watch. I have a breakfast meeting with your CEO in 40 minutes. Shall I bring up your conduct? I didn't, Brock stammered. You have 10 seconds to leave before I make a call, Archer said, his voice dangerously soft. Your choice. Brock and his friends practically tripped over themselves getting to the door. In the ringing silence they left behind, Lucia stared at Elliot Archer, completely bewildered. The man who'd presumably come to deliver the final blow to her cafe had just defended her. The shark had scared off the barracudas. Archer turned back to her, his expression unreadable. Now, about speaking with the owner. Lucia straightened her spine. You're looking at her. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps. Respect, before his business mask returned. Ms. Morales, I believe we have matters to discuss. Lucia's chin lifted, her grandmother's fighting spirit surging through her veins. Yes, Mr. Archer, we certainly do. Neither of them could have guessed that this meeting, billionaire and cafe owner, shark and prey, would be the first chapter of a story neither had seen coming. Sunset Cafe, 30 minutes later. Absolutely not. Lucia crossed her arms over her chest, glaring at the contract Elliot had placed between them on the small cafe table. They sat in the corner booth, her at home in the worn leather seat, him looking distinctly out of place, like a jaguar trying to fit into a housecat's bed. The cafe had emptied after the morning rush, leaving them in a silence punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the ancient clock that had kept time in Sunset Cafe for 3 generations. Ms. Morales, Elliot said, his patience clearly wearing thin. The offer is more than generous, 15% above market value. This cafe isn't just property, Mr. Archer, it's my heritage. Heritage doesn't pay property taxes. Lucia leaned forward. Why this block? Why my cafe? There are plenty of other places in Manhattan you could bulldoze for your luxury condos. Something flickered across Elliot's face. Annoyance, perhaps. Respect for her directness. This location is strategic. The development will revitalize the area. You mean gentrify it until none of the current residents can afford to stay? His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I create jobs, Ms. Morales. I improve economies. You destroy communities. For a moment, they stared at each other across the table. Billionaire and barista. Power and passion. Ice and fire. Elliot broke the silence first, surprising himself. I defended you earlier. Most people would show some gratitude. Lucia's laugh was short and sharp. For what? Scaring away the small shark before the great white moves in for the kill? She shook her head. Why did you do that anyway? Defend me against Brock? The question caught Elliot off guard. Why had he intervened? Something about the scene, her humiliation, the public mockery, had triggered a visceral response he hadn't experienced in years. Your ex's behavior was unprofessional, he said finally. That's it? Lucia pressed, dark eyes studying him. Nothing to do with being called names in public? Nothing to do with having your private struggles broadcast for everyone to hear? Elliot went still. There was no possible way she could know about his past, about that rain-soaked day at Westfield Academy. Yet her words hit with uncomfortable precision. You're deflecting, he said coolly. We were discussing business. Lucia sighed, running a hand through her curls. Look around, Mr. Archer. Really look. Against his better judgment, Elliot did. The cafe walls were covered with photographs, 3 generations of women with Lucia's same smile. Newspaper clippings about the cafe's history. A wall where customers had written notes of gratitude over the years. Children's drawings. Community. Awards. This isn't just a business, Lucia said softly. This is a living history. My grandmother crossed the border with nothing but the clothes on her back and the recipes in her head. She worked 3 jobs until she could afford to open this place. My mother expanded it during the 90s recession when everyone said she would fail. I put myself through business school making coffee here. A compelling story, Elliot said, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling in his chest. But sentimentality is the enemy of good business. Is it? Lucia challenged. Then why? Did you keep your father's pocket watch? Elliot's hand instinctively went to his waistcoat where the antique timepiece rested, a family heirloom, the one thing he'd insisted on keeping when everything else was sold off to cover his father's debts. How did you checked it 3 times since sitting down, Lucia said. It's too old to be something you bought yourself, too worn to be for show. It matters to you. Elliot felt uncomfortably exposed. This woman, this struggling cafe owner with financial problems and flour on her jeans, saw too much. My personal effects are irrelevant to this discussion, he said stiffly. The fact remains, Ms. Morales, that without this sale, you'll lose. The cafe anyway. The property taxes alone, which mysteriously doubled after your company started buying properties on this block, Lucia shot back. Elliot didn't deny it. Plan B was standard procedure. Apply pressure using every legal means available. He'd done it dozens of times without a second thought. A young woman with an elderly companion entered the cafe, and Lucia glanced over, immediately rising. Excuse me, she said to Elliot. Some customers matter more than business meetings. Before he could respond, she had moved to the counter. Mrs. Abramowitz, the usual today? If it's not too much trouble, dear, the elderly woman said, her voice wavering. For you? Never. Lucia began preparing what appeared to be a complex tea service, adding an extra pastry to the tray. I forgot my wallet again, the elderly woman whispered, embarrassed. Don't worry about it. We'll settle up next time, Lucia said, loudly enough for Elliot to hear. That's what you said last week and the week before, Mrs. Abramowitz fussed. I'm not a charity case, Lucia. It's not charity when it's family, Lucia replied, helping the woman to a table. How's the hip today? Elliot watched the interaction with growing discomfort. His investigative team had provided financial records showing Sunset Cafe operating at a loss for the past 18 months. Now he understood why. Lucia Morales was subsidizing half the neighborhood out of her own pocket. When she returned to their table, he couldn't help asking, Do you let all your customers eat for free? Only the ones who need it, she replied without apology. Mrs. Abramowitz taught kindergarten for 40 years. Her pension barely covers her medications. That's not sustainable business. Maybe I measure success differently than you do, Mr. Archer. In bankruptcy? Lucia's eyes flashed. In humanity. For a moment, they were at an impasse again. Then, Elliot surprised himself by making an impulsive decision. I have a proposition. Lucia arched an eyebrow. Another lowball offer? A challenge, he corrected. 1 month. If you can make this cafe profitable in 30 days, truly profitable, not creative accounting, I'll withdraw my development plans for this block entirely. Lucia's eyes widened in disbelief. And if I can't? You sell to me at the price, offered with a non-disclosure agreement and a clean, press-friendly exit. Why would you offer this? Good question, Elliot thought. What was he doing? This wasn't how he operated, yet something about this woman and this cafe had gotten under his skin. Consider it a test of your business degree, he said smoothly. You claim this place is viable. Prove it. And how exactly am I supposed to transform the cafe's finances in 30 days when I've been trying for 3 years? Elliot stood, straightening his suit jacket. That's where it gets interesting, Ms. Morales. I'm going to help you. You? Lucia laughed incredulously. The shark is offering swimming lessons? The shark is worth billions because he knows how to make businesses profitable. Elliot countered. Consider it free consulting from someone who charges 8 figures for his advice. And why would you do that? Elliot wasn't entirely sure himself. Perhaps it was the challenge. Perhaps it was those photographs on the wall, reminding him uncomfortably of what family legacy meant. Or perhaps it was something in her fierce, unapologetic defense of values his wealth had allowed him to forget. Let's call it professional curiosity, he said finally. Do we have a deal? Lucia studied him for a long, tense moment. Then she extended her hand. 1 month, starting tomorrow. When their hands met, neither was prepared for the jolt of awareness that passed between them. A current of something that had nothing to do with business, and everything to do with the unexpected recognition of an equally matched opponent. What neither realized was that they had just set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about success, failure, and the true cost of protecting one's heart. Sunset Cafe, 5:45 a.m., day 1 of the challenge. The sky was still dark when Elliot Archer's Bentley rolled to a stop outside Sunset Cafe. His driver, Antoine, couldn't hide his surprise. Sir, we're actually stopping? I thought you wanted to drive by before your morning meeting. Wait here, Elliot replied, adjusting his custom Brioni suit as he stepped onto the sidewalk. The cafe was technically closed, but warm light spilled from the windows. Through the glass, he could see Lucia moving about, her hair tied back, flour dusting her forearms as she worked at a large wooden prep table that had clearly seen decades of use. He rapped sharply on the door. Lucia looked up, momentarily startled, then narrowed her eyes when she recognized him. She wiped her hands on her apron and approached, unlocking the door but blocking the entrance. Our deal starts at 8 a.m., Mr. Archer. She had dark circles under her eyes, but her gaze was no less fierce than yesterday. Serious businesses begin before sunrise, he replied. And if we're working together for a month, I think you can call me Elliot. Lucia hesitated, then stepped aside. Fine, but I'm not changing my schedule to impress you, Elliot. His name on her lips caused an unexpected ripple of awareness down his spine. Inside, the cafe smelled of fresh bread, cinnamon, and coffee beans. Elliot surveyed the cozy but dated interior. The wooden floors had been lovingly maintained, but showed wear. The vintage espresso machine gleamed, but was hardly state-of-the-art. You bake everything yourself? He asked, watching as she returned to kneading dough with surprising strength in her slender arms. From scratch, every day, she worked the dough with practiced movements. My grandmother's recipes. That's inefficient. Pre-made dough would save hours of labor costs. Lucia's hands stilled. Do you analyze the thread count of your mother's handmade quilts too? Or is it just my family traditions? You're eager to dismantle? I'm simply pointing out. I know exactly what you're pointing out, she interrupted, shaping the dough with perhaps more force than necessary. But people don't line up every morning for factory-produced pastries. They come for authenticity, for connection, for something made by human hands that actually care. Elliot watched her work, trying to see the business logic in such labor-intensive practices. And how much do you charge for this connection? $4 for a standard pastry, $6 for the specialty items. The ingredients and labor alone cost more than that. Not everything is about maximizing profit margins. Elliot removed his suit jacket, carefully hanging it on a nearby hook, and rolled up the sleeves of his Egyptian cotton shirt. For the next 30 days, Ms. Morales, everything is precisely about maximizing profit margins. Lucia glanced up, momentarily distracted by the unexpected sight of Elliot Archer, Billionaire CEO, with his sleeves rolled up in her kitchen. The man was infuriatingly handsome, which only made his cold business demeanor more frustrating. Fine, she conceded, but I won't compromise on quality. Then we raise the prices. My customers can't afford. Some can't, he corrected, stepping closer to examine her workspace. But I guarantee others can and would pay more. Your pricing structure is fundamentally flawed. Lucia tucked a loose curl behind her ear, leaving a smudge of flour on her cheek. How would you know? You've been here once. Twice now, he corrected with the hint of a smile. And I had my team analyze the neighborhood demographics. You're in a transitional area, mixed incomes, mixed ages. Your one-price-fits-all model ignores market segmentation. Lucia continued working, but he could tell she was listening. Show me your books, he said. I'm busy. They're in the office. She nodded toward a small door behind the counter. To her surprise, Elliot rolled his sleeves higher and stepped beside her at the prep table. What can I do to help you finish? Faster. Lucia stared at him, flour-dusted and incredulous. You're offering to help bake? I'm offering to expedite our timeline, he clarified. Efficient use of available resources. A reluctant smile tugged at her lips. Can the great Elliot Archer even crack an egg without an assistant doing it for him? Something flickered in his eyes, a challenge accepted. Give me a task, Ms. Morales. Any task. Lucia studied him for a moment, then pointed to a bowl of chilled dough. That needs to be rolled out to exactly 1/4 inch thickness, then cut into circles using that cutter. Think you can handle it, Mr. CEO? Elliot approached the task with the same intensity he applied to billion-dollar acquisitions. He measured the dough with the ruler provided, rolled it with precise, even pressure, and cut perfect circles. Not your first time in a kitchen, Lucia observed, surprised. Elliot kept his eyes on his work. My mother worked night shifts at the hospital. Someone had to cook. The casual revelation of something so personal hung in the air between them. Lucia had read about Elliot Archer's ruthless business tactics, his wealth, his power, but nothing about him making dinner as a child while his mother worked. What did you cook? She asked softly. Nothing complex. Pasta, eggs. I could make a decent chicken by 14. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. My specialty was stretching groceries to last until payday. Lucia's hand stilled. This glimpse behind the armor of the feared executioner was unexpectedly human. Before she could respond, Elliot seemed to realize he'd revealed too much and swiftly changed the subject. Your equipment is outdated, he said, nodding toward the vintage espresso machine. It's costing you in efficiency. That machine makes perfect coffee, Lucia defended. Modern ones can't match the flavor profile. Have you tested that theory? Or is it another sentimental attachment masquerading as business strategy? Their eyes met across the kitchen, a clash of philosophies as fundamental as their backgrounds. Let's make a deal, Lucia proposed. I'll show you my books, and consider your price restructuring if you actually try the coffee from that outdated machine. I don't drink coffee after 6 a.m. Disrupts productivity. Lucia laughed, a genuine, warm sound that seemed to brighten the early morning kitchen. God forbid anything disrupt the almighty productivity. 5 minutes, Elliot. 5 minutes to taste. Something made with passion instead of efficiency. Against his better judgment, Elliot nodded. 5 minutes. Half an hour later, they sat across from each other in Lucia's tiny office, surrounded by stacks of receipts, invoices, and handwritten ledgers. The promised 5 minutes had stretched when Elliot, to his own surprise, had requested a second cup of the remarkable coffee and had found himself asking about the complex brewing process. Your accounting system is archaic, he said, sorting through papers. Some might call it vintage, Lucia countered, but the humor in her voice had faded as the reality of the cafe's financial situation spread across the desk between them. Elliot studied the numbers with growing concern. The situation was worse than his initial assessment. You've been operating at a significant loss for over 2 years. Lucia's shoulders tensed. I'm aware. The interest rates on these loans are criminal. That's what happens when traditional banks won't touch you, she said quietly. Brock, my ex, convinced me that his financial advisor friend could help with expansion financing. It turned out to be a predatory lender. By the time I realized it, I was trapped. Elliot felt an unfamiliar surge of anger on her behalf. Your ex set you up with a loan shark? He didn't see it that way. High-risk investment opportunity was his term. Her bitter laugh held no humor. After we broke up, he tried to convince me to sell the cafe to his development friend. Now I understand why. Commission, Elliot concluded. He'd get a finder's fee if you sold. Exactly. When I refused, the property taxes mysteriously doubled, and health inspectors started showing up weekly. She looked up at him, realization dawning. You're doing? Elliot didn't deny it. Standard procedure for reluctant sellers. Standard procedure, she repeated slowly. Do you ever consider the human cost of your standard procedures? The question hung in the air between them, unexpectedly heavy. Business isn't personal, he said automatically. Isn't it? Lucia gestured around the tiny office. This business is deeply personal. To me, to my employees, to the community we serve. Her eyes held his, challenging. What about you, Elliot? Was becoming the executioner personal? The question struck too close to memories of rain-soaked humiliation, of vows made by a hungry teenage boy. We're getting off track, he said firmly. The challenge is making this cafe profitable, not psychoanalyzing my business philosophy. Lucia studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Fair enough. She gathered her curls into a fresh ponytail. So, financial genius, what's your grand plan? Elliot laid out 3 pages of notes he'd already compiled. 3 major changes. First, tiered pricing structure. Premium options for those who can afford it, while maintaining your community initiatives. Second, operational efficiency. Third, expanded revenue streams. You developed all this since yesterday? I work fast, Elliot replied without arrogance, simply stating fact. The question is, are you willing to implement it? That depends on whether your efficiency means firing Danny or replacing my grandmother's recipes with frozen dough. Neither, Elliot surprised her by saying. Your staff clearly love working here. That's valuable. And the quality of your product is your differentiator. We build on your strengths, not dismantle them. Something shifted in Lucia's expression, a subtle softening, a hint of respect. We'll start with the low-hanging fruit, he continued. Rewiring your electrical system could cut your utilities by 30%. With what capital? Lucia challenged. I can barely make payroll. Elliot hesitated, then made another impulsive decision. My team will handle the upgrades. Consider it an investment in our challenge. I don't want your charity. It's not charity. It's a business decision. If you succeed, I lose my development project. If you fail, the improvements increase the property value when I purchase it. Either way, I benefit. Lucia seemed to consider this logic, then slowly nodded. Okay, what else? The bell at the front door jingled, signaling the arrival of her first customers. Time to open, she said, standing. Ready to see how a real cafe operates, Mr. Archer? I don't typically work front of house, he replied dryly. Lucia tossed him an apron, simple black with the cafe's sunset logo. Today you do. You want to transform my business? First, understand it. Elliot stared at the apron in his hands, worth perhaps $15, a world away from his $15,000 suit. This wasn't how billionaire CEOs spent their mornings. This wasn't how he conducted business. This wasn't part of the plan. Yet something about Lucia's challenging gaze made it impossible to refuse. 1 hour, he conceded, reluctantly tying the apron around his waist. Good, Lucia grinned. I'll even let you keep your tips. The morning unfurled in a blur of activity Elliot hadn't anticipated. He observed Lucia greeting customers by name, remembering their usual orders, asking about their families. He watched elderly patrons receive subtle discounts without losing dignity, and young students find a haven to study with affordable refills. Most surprisingly, he found himself drafted into service, running the register while Lucia prepared orders. The mechanics were simple enough, but the human interaction was foreign territory. Customers looked at him curiously, this stern-faced man in an expensive shirt and cafe apron. "New guy?" one regular asked Lucia with a smile. "Temporary consultant," she replied with a meaningful look at Elliot. "Very temporary." By mid-morning, something unexpected had happened. Elliot had begun to see the cafe not as a failing business on valuable real estate, but as a living ecosystem, one with Lucia at its heart, pumping warmth and connection through every interaction. And perhaps most unsettling of all, he found himself wondering if the cold efficiency of his billion-dollar empire lacked something fundamental that this struggling cafe had in abundance. When he finally removed the apron at 10 a.m., preparing to leave for meetings he couldn't postpone, he found himself saying words he hadn't planned. "I'll be back tomorrow morning." Lucia's surprise mirrored his own. "Tomorrow's Saturday, our busiest day." "Then I definitely shouldn't miss it," he replied, gathering his jacket. "If I'm going to save this cafe, I need to see it at its best." He paused at the door. "And its worst." As his driver pulled away from the curb, Elliot found himself looking back at the modest storefront with its faded sign and warm windows. For the first time in years, his thoughts weren't consumed by acquisition targets and profit margins, but by flour-dusted hands and the challenge in dark eyes that seemed to see straight through his carefully constructed armor. What he didn't yet realize was that those eyes had glimpsed something he had spent a lifetime hiding. Not just from the world, but from himself. The boy who had once stood hungry in the rain was still there, beneath the tailored suits and billion-dollar empire. And Lucia Morales somehow had recognized him. Archer Tower, Manhattan, 2 weeks into the challenge. "You've canceled 3 board meetings in 2 weeks. Marcus stood in the doorway of Elliot's office, concern evident in his usually impassive face. "The Reynolds acquisition is stalling, and Tokyo is still waiting for your decision on the harbor development." Elliot barely looked up from the spreadsheets covering his desk. Not Archer Industries projections, but detailed analyses of Sunset Cafe's operations. "The Reynolds deal can wait," he replied, making another notation. "And tell Tokyo I need their revised environmental impact report before I make any decisions." Marcus approached cautiously. In a decade as Elliot's right-hand man, he'd never seen the CEO so distracted. "Sir, the executive committee is questioning your focus. There are rumors." This finally captured Elliot's attention. "What rumors?" Marcus hesitated. "That you're spending every morning at a small cafe downtown. That you've been seen carrying trays and serving customers. That you've been spotted laughing with a certain cafe owner." Elliot's expression hardened. "My personal time is my own, Marcus." "Of course, sir. But when the CEO of Archer Industries starts working as a barista, people talk." Marcus gestured to the cafe spreadsheets. "Is this about the development project? Because we could simply withdraw the offer and move on. There are other properties." "It's not that simple." Elliot leaned back in his chair, fatigue evident in the lines around his eyes. The past 2 weeks had been unlike any in his carefully structured life. Early mornings at the cafe, working alongside Lucia, making operational changes, witnessing the delicate ecosystem of community and commerce she'd created. "Then what is it?" Marcus pressed, his concern genuine. "You haven't been yourself." Or perhaps, Elliot thought with unsettling clarity, "I'm more myself than I've been in 20 years. "The challenge ends in 2 weeks, Elliot said finally. "Once it's resolved, everything returns to normal." Marcus looked unconvinced, but knew better than to push further. "There's one more thing. The charity gala is tomorrow night." Elliot suppressed a groan. The annual Archer Foundation Gala was a high-profile fundraiser he typically approached with clinical efficiency. Shake hands, give the rehearsed speech, secure donations, leave early. I remember. Good. Marcus placed an invitation on the desk. Your attendance is mandatory, given the foundation bears your name. 7 p.m., black tie. After Marcus left, Elliot stared at the gilt-edged invitation. The gala represented everything he'd built: power, influence, prestige. Yet instead of the usual satisfaction, he felt a strange hollowness. His thoughts drifted to Sunset Cafe. In 2 weeks of intense collaboration, he and Lucia had implemented significant changes. New tiered pricing that allowed wealthy customers to pay premium rates while maintaining affordable options. A revamped electrical system that slashed utility costs. Strategic scheduling that maximized employee efficiency without sacrificing the personal touch. And throughout it all, Lucia had challenged him, argued with him, surprised him, and inexplicably drawn him back day after day. The cafe's finances were improving, but not fast enough. Despite his best efforts, it seemed unlikely Lucia would meet the profitability target before the 30-day deadline, which meant he would acquire the property as planned. Sunset Cafe would become another successful Archer development, another neighborhood transformed, another victory. So why did the thought fill him with such discomfort? His phone chimed with a text from Lucia. Emergency at cafe. Pipe burst in kitchen. Need help ASAP. Without hesitation, Elliot grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. Sunset Cafe, 3 hours later. You have to admit, we make a pretty good disaster response team, Lucia said, collapsing onto a chair beside Elliot. The kitchen floor was still damp, but the crisis had been averted. Elliot had arrived to find Lucia frantically trying to contain flooding from a burst pipe under the sink. He'd immediately rolled up his sleeves, designer suit be damned, shut off the main water valve, and called his company's emergency maintenance team. Now, exhausted and disheveled, they surveyed the damage. Elliot's Italian leather shoes were likely ruined, and Lucia's curls had frizzed spectacularly in the humidity. Your plumbing is as outdated as your accounting, Elliot remarked, but without his usual sharpness. Lucia laughed, the sound brightening the dingy kitchen. And yet your $1,000 shoes got just as wet as my $20 sneakers. $2,000, he corrected with a reluctant smile. For shoes? That's obscene. Says the woman who spends 4 hours making pastries she could buy wholesale. Touché. Lucia nudged his shoulder playfully, a casual touch that sent an unexpected current through him. Seriously, though, thank you. You didn't have to drop everything and come. I did, he replied, surprising himself with his honesty. We have a deal. Lucia studied him, her dark eyes thoughtful. Is that the only reason? The question hung between them, fraught with implications neither was ready to examine. The repairs will be completed tonight, Elliot said, deflecting. You can open normally tomorrow. I can't afford emergency repair costs right now. It's covered, he said simply. Lucia's expression shifted from gratitude to wariness. More investment in our challenge? Precisely. Elliot stood, suddenly needing distance from her perceptive gaze. Consider it enlightened self-interest. Right. Lucia rose as well, pushing back damp curls from her face. The infamous Elliot. Archer wouldn't possibly help someone without an angle. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. It's your whole brand, isn't it? The ruthless businessman who never makes a move without calculating the profit margin. Her tone wasn't accusatory, more resigned, which somehow felt worse. You don't know me, Elliot said quietly. Don't I? Lucia challenged. 2 weeks of working side by side, 12-hour days. I've seen you handle difficult customers, fix the ancient espresso machine, reorganize my entire inventory system. I've Watched you with Mrs. Abramowitz and the college students and even cranky Mr. Peterson. Elliot shifted uncomfortably. Had he really spent that much time here? Had she really been watching him that closely? Your financial strategy is sound, he conceded, steering back to safer territory. The pricing tier system is working, and customer volume is up 14%. But you're still not on track to meet the 30-day target. Lucia's shoulders slumped slightly. I know. Something in her defeated posture triggered a protective instinct Elliot hadn't felt in years. Without analyzing his motives, a rare occurrence for a man who calculated every move, he heard himself say, "Come to the gala with me tomorrow night." Lucia blinked, clearly startled. What? The annual Archer Foundation Gala, he clarified, suddenly committed to this impulsive idea. Manhattan's wealthiest philanthropist will be there, potential investors, influential people who could become patrons of a certain authentic cafe experience. You want me to network at your fancy charity ball? Lucia looked skeptical. I don't exactly have gala attire in my closet, Elliot. That can be arranged. I'm not wearing anything you buy me, she said firmly. Then borrow something. He was warming to the plan now. This is a business opportunity, Lucia. The kind of people who attend could become your premium customers. One investor could solve your financial problems overnight. Lucia considered this, conflict evident in her expression. This isn't part of our deal. Consider it an addendum. Elliot checked his watch. I need to attend regardless. You can either join me and potentially save your cafe, or stay home on principle and lose it. Your choice. Lucia's eyes narrowed at his framing, but he could see the strategic calculus happening behind them. Finally, she nodded. Fine, but I'm not pretending to be someone I'm not. No Cinderella makeover. Agreed. Your authenticity is your strongest asset. The words came out more genuine than he'd intended. To recover his businesslike demeanor, he added, I'll send a car at 6:30. I'll take the subway and meet you there. Elliot nearly argued, but recognized the stubborn set of her jaw. As you wish. The Plaza Hotel, 7 p.m. sharp. Wear something that won't get you turned away at the door. Lucia rolled her eyes at his phrasing. Such a charmer. As he turned to leave, she called after him, Elliot, why are you really doing this? He paused, not turning back fully. Like I said, it's a business opportunity. For me, maybe. But for you? If I succeed, you lose your development project. The question pierced through his practiced armor. Why was he helping her so determinedly? Why had he spent 2 weeks immersed in her world, fascinated by her resilience and passion? Why had the cold satisfaction of another successful acquisition been replaced by something more complex and unsettling? Perhaps I'm curious to see if your way can actually work, he said finally, a partial truth. Lucia seemed to sense there was more, but didn't press. Well, whatever your reasons, I'll see you tomorrow night. I'll be the one not wearing $2,000 shoes. The Plaza Hotel, 7:15 p.m. Elliot checked his watch for the third time. In 5 minutes, nodding mechanically as a financial services CEO droned on about market projections. The grand ballroom of the plaza was filled with Manhattan's elite. Old money, new tech wealth, celebrities, politicians, all gathered under crystal chandeliers to support the Archer Foundation's educational initiatives while showcasing their designer finery and making strategic social connections. Typically, Elliot moved through these events with practiced precision. Tonight, however, his attention was fractured, his gaze continually drifting to the entrance. She wasn't coming. It was already 15 minutes past the start time. He'd miscalculated, pushing too hard, framing the invitation in cold business terms when perhaps... His thought process halted abruptly as a ripple of subtle reactions moved through the crowd near the entrance. Several heads turned, conversations paused. and Elliot found himself excusing his way through clusters of guests before he'd made a conscious decision to move. Lucia stood just inside the ballroom entrance, a vision so unexpected it momentarily stole his breath. She wore a simple but elegant midnight blue dress that complemented her curves without flaunting them. Her wild curls had been partially tamed into a sophisticated updo with several rebellious tendrils framing her face. She wore minimal jewelry, simple silver earrings, and a delicate necklace that drew attention to her collarbones. But what struck Elliot most wasn't the dress or the hair. It was the way she held herself, chin lifted, shoulders back, unwavering, despite clearly feeling out of place. The same quiet dignity she showed when handling difficult customers or facing financial setbacks. She spotted him across the room, and something in her expression shifted. Relief, perhaps recognition. As he approached, he noticed subtle details. The dress was well made but not designer, likely borrowed as she'd insisted. Her makeup was minimal, enhancing rather than masking her features. Her only concession to the formal setting was a pair of heeled silver sandals that brought her closer to his height. "You came," he said, the relief in his voice surprising them both. "I said I would." Her eyes took in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, though I'm clearly underdressed. "You're perfect," he replied automatically, then quickly corrected himself. "Perfectly appropriate for the event." A hint of a smile played at her lips. High praise from the man who criticized my filing system as chaotic at best. Elliot found himself smiling in return, a genuine expression that felt foreign on his face in this setting. Nearby, a photographer captured the moment, the flash, drawing Elliot back to awareness of their surroundings. "Come," he said, offering his arm. "There are people you should meet." To his surprise, she slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow without argument. The warmth of her touch through his jacket sleeve was distractingly pleasant. "So, this is how the other half lives," Lucia murmured, as he guided her through the glittering crowd. "Actually, more like the other 1%. 0.1% in this room," Elliot corrected. "Focus on potential cafe patrons, the art gallery owner from Soho, the tech CEO who works nearby, the magazine editor always looking for authentic spaces." Lucia nodded, but as they moved deeper into the crowd, he felt her tense beside him. Eyes were turning their way. Curious, speculative, judgmental. Whispers followed in their wake. "They're staring," she said under her breath. "Because I rarely bring guests to these functions," he replied. "And never someone so unsuitable?" she supplied, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. "Interesting," he corrected. "Most people here are interchangeable parts in a social machine." Before she could respond, they were intercepted by a silver-haired woman dripping in diamonds. "Elliot, darling, the Foundation's work this year is simply marvelous." "Mrs. Whitmore," Elliot nodded politely. "May I introduce Lucia Morales, owner of Sunset Cafe?" The woman's smile became fixed. "How quaint. And how do you two know each other?" Before Elliot could formulate a suitably vague response, Lucia answered with disarming directness. "Mr. Archer is trying to buy my cafe so he can tear it down for luxury condos. I'm refusing to sell, so we made a bet." Mrs. Whitmore blinked rapidly. "I see." "It's a bit more nuanced than that," Elliot interjected smoothly. "Not really," Lucia countered with a sweet smile, though I left out the part where he's been washing dishes and serving coffee to help me win the bet against him. Mrs. Whitmore's expression suggested she was calculating the fastest socially acceptable escape route. "How unconventional. If you'll excuse me, I simply must speak with the Hendersons before they leave." As she retreated, Elliot turned to Lucia with a mixture of exasperation and reluctant amusement. "That's not exactly strategic networking. Was I supposed to pretend we met at a polo match?" Lucia shrugged unapologetically. I told you I wouldn't be someone I'm not. Before he could respond, another voice interrupted, one that caused Elliot's spine to stiffen. Well, if it isn't the executioner himself, slumming with the help. James Harrington stood before them, older but unmistakable. The same boy who had once mocked a hungry Elliot in the rain, now a middle-aged investment banker with a cruel smile that hadn't changed in 23 years. Elliot's face became an expressionless mask. James. It's been ages, James said, his gaze sliding dismissively over Lucia before returning to Elliot. Quite the empire you've built. Who would have thought the scholarship charity case would end up with his name on a building? Beside him, Elliot felt Lucia go very still, her attention sharpening. The Archer Foundation provides scholarships to hundreds of deserving students, Elliot replied neutrally, though his pulse had accelerated. Merit, not background, determines potential. James snorted softly. Still sensitive about the past, I see. He turned to Lucia with false congeniality. Did he tell you we were schoolmates? Poor Elliot here had quite the chip on his shoulder, always trying to prove himself. Lucia's dark eyes flicked between the two men, clearly perceiving undercurrents, from long before her time. And did he? Prove himself? Oh, undoubtedly, James chuckled. Though some might say he overcompensated. The ruthless reputation, the corporate raids, the neighborhoods transformed regardless of the human cost. All to ensure no one would ever again mistake him for the boy who couldn't afford lunch. Elliot's jaw clenched, but decades of boardroom. Discipline kept his expression neutral. Inside, however, he was 15 again, humiliated, exposed, vulnerable. Then Lucia did something unexpected. She stepped slightly closer to Elliot, her shoulder almost touching his arm, a subtle position of alliance. Interesting perspective, she said, her voice deceptively light. Though I find people who define others by their past are usually compensating for an unremarkable present. James blinked, clearly unused to being challenged in these circles. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. Lucia Morales. I own a cafe downtown. Her smile was dazzling but sharp. You should visit sometime. We serve humble pie as a specialty. For a moment, James seemed genuinely speechless. Then his expression hardened. Charming. Elliot always did have unusual taste in distractions. He raised his champagne glass in a mock toast. Enjoy your evening slumming, Archer. Some of us have serious business to discuss. As he walked away, Elliot realized he'd been holding his breath. 23 years of success, power, and wealth, and James Harrington could still make him feel like that humiliated boy with empty pockets. So that's why, Lucia said softly beside him. Why what? Why you defended me against Brock that first day. You recognized the humiliation. Her eyes held understanding rather than pity. That's him, isn't it? The one from the schoolyard. Elliot stared at her, momentarily disoriented. How had she pieced together a past he never discussed? How did you talk in your sleep, she said, her lips curving into a teasing smile at his alarmed expression. I'm kidding. It was just obvious from the prehistoric tension between you. Plus, rich jerks tend to follow a pattern. Before Elliot could respond, the orchestra began playing, signaling the start of the dancing portion of the evening. Couples moved toward the center of the ballroom. We should continue networking, Elliot said, trying to regain his footing after the unsettling encounter. Lucia's expression softened. Dance with me first. That's not part of the business strategy. No, she agreed, but it might be part of the human strategy. She held out her hand, a simple invitation. One dance won't bankrupt your precious schedule, Archer. Perhaps it was the lingering effect of confronting his past. Perhaps it was the way the chandelier light caught the warmth in her eyes. Or perhaps it was simply that, for the first time, in decades, Elliot wanted something that had nothing to do with business strategy at all. He took her hand and led her to the dance floor. As they moved together to the music, her hand in his, her other hand resting lightly on his shoulder, Elliot experienced a strange sensation of worlds colliding. Here was Lucia, flower-dusted, stubborn, passionate Lucia, moving gracefully in his arms in the rarefied air of Manhattan high society. "You're a good dancer," she remarked, surprise evident in her voice. "Ballroom dancing was part of the Westfield Academy curriculum," he replied. "Proper socialization for future leaders." "Ah, and here I learned from YouTube videos before my cousin's wedding." She laughed softly. "Different worlds." "Yet here we are," he said, guiding her through a turn. Their eyes met, and something shifted between them. A recognition, a possibility neither had anticipated when they'd struck their business deal in a struggling cafe 2 weeks ago. "Why did you really invite me tonight, Elliot?" Lucia asked, her voice low enough that only he could hear. The question deserved honesty, but the truth was complex, and not entirely clear even to himself. All he knew was that watching her navigate this unfamiliar world with the same authenticity and courage she brought to everything else had awakened something long dormant within him. "Perhaps," he said carefully. "I wanted to see if you could change the atmosphere here, the way you've changed the cafe." "And have I?" Elliot glanced around the ballroom, at the rigid social hierarchies and calculated interactions, then back, at the woman in his arms, who had faced down his childhood bully without hesitation and challenged his carefully constructed worldview at every turn. "You've certainly changed something," he admitted. The music drew to a close, but for a moment, neither moved to break apart. They stood together on the dance floor, on the precipice of a realization that had nothing to do with business deals or 30-day challenges. Then a camera flash broke the moment, and reality rushed back in. Elliot stepped away, suddenly aware of curious eyes and whispers around them. "We should continue with introductions," he said, his voice more formal than he intended. Lucia studied him for a beat longer than was comfortable, then nodded. "Lead the way, Mr. Archer." As they moved back into the crowd, Elliot was acutely conscious of her beside him, and of the unexpected truth he hadn't been able to voice on the dance floor. He had invited her tonight not for business networking, not for strategic advantage, but simply because he had wanted her there. Because in 2 short weeks, Lucia Morales had somehow become the most real thing in his carefully constructed world. And that realization was more terrifying than any hostile takeover he had ever orchestrated. Sunset Cafe. Day 30 of the challenge rain lashed against the windows of Sunset Cafe, eerily reminiscent of that day at Westfield Academy 23 years ago. Elliot stood by the window, watching sheets of water transform Manhattan into a blurry watercolor. Behind him, Lucia sat at a corner table surrounded by spreadsheets, financial projections, and a laptop displaying the cafe's monthly figures. The cafe was closed, a rare occurrence, to allow for their final accounting. The deadline had arrived. 30 days since they'd struck their improbable deal. "It's not enough," Lucia said quietly, breaking the heavy silence between them. Elliot turned from the window, in the dim light of the rainy afternoon, with her hair pulled back in a messy bun and dark circles under her eyes from weeks of relentless work. She had never looked more beautiful to him, or more vulnerable. "We're close," he offered, approaching the table. "Revenue is up 28%, expenses down 17%. Customer retention has improved dramatically. But we're still 8% short of the profitability target," Lucia finished, a tremor in her voice betraying her exhaustion. "I've checked the numbers 3 times. Elliot sat across from her, examining the figures he already knew by heart. The past 30 days had transformed Sunset Cafe. New, energy-efficient appliances gleamed in the kitchen. A redesigned menu balanced premium offerings with community favorites. Strategic social media campaigns had brought in younger customers willing to pay higher prices for authentic experiences. They had worked side by side through 18-hour days, argued over every detail, celebrated small victories, and navigated setbacks. Somewhere along the way, the challenge had become less about winning or losing, and more about the shared vision they'd unexpectedly created together. But the cold, hard numbers on the page were unambiguous. 8%, Elliot repeated, softly. In business terms, that's remarkably close for a 30-day turnaround. But not close enough, Lucia said, meeting his gaze directly. According to our agreement. The agreement, the challenge, the deal that had brought them together and now stood between them like an invisible wall. There are variables to consider, Elliot began, uncharacteristically hesitant. Market conditions, the unexpected pipe repairs, the unusually rainy spring suppressing foot traffic. Lucia's expression softened with something like tenderness. Elliot Archer, are you actually making excuses for a business failure? It's not a failure, he said firmly. Any analyst would call this a remarkable turnaround. But not enough to meet our terms, she insisted, a sad smile playing at her lips. You win, Elliot. The cafe is yours. She slid a folder toward him, the signed sales agreement he'd prepared 30 days ago. I've already signed it. Elliot stared at the folder without touching it, a strange hollowness expanding in his chest. It's funny, Lucia continued, gathering scattered papers into neat stacks. A month ago, I would have fought to the bitter end. Now I'm almost at peace. She gestured around the cafe. You were right about some things. I was running this place on sentiment rather than strategy. My grandmother built something wonderful, but times change. Lucia, let me finish, she said gently. These past 30 days showed me what's actually worth fighting for. It's not the building. It's not even the cafe itself. It's the community, the connection, the human element that made this place special. Her eyes shone with unshed tears. That's the part worth saving. Elliot felt something shift within him. Tectonic plates rearranging his internal landscape. 30 days ago, her words would have struck him as sentimental nonsense. Now, they resonated with a truth he could no longer deny. What will you do? He asked, his voice rougher than intended. Lucia's smile was brave but frayed at the edges. Start over, I suppose. Take what I've learned, what you've taught me, and build something new, something sustainable. She rose from the table, moving to the wall of photographs. 3 generations of Morales women and their cafe. My grandmother started with nothing but recipes and determination. I have more than that. Elliot watched her gently touch a faded photograph of her grandmother, the resemblance clear in the proud set of the jaw, the warmth in the eyes. The gala connections helped, she continued, her back to him. 3 potential investors expressed interest. Not enough to save this place in time, but enough for a fresh start somewhere else. Elliot remained silent, wrestling with unfamiliar emotions. The victory he'd anticipated felt hollow, even bitter. The development project that had seemed so important 30 days ago now felt insignificant compared to what would be lost. You've been quiet, Lucia observed, turning back to face him. No triumphant speech? No business is business lecture? Would you believe me if I said I don't want to win this way? He asked simply. Lucia studied him, tilting her head slightly. A month ago? No. Now? Her expression softened. Now I might. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, a fitting soundtrack for the storm inside Elliot's mind. Rising from the table, he moved to stand before her, close enough to see the flecks of amber in her dark eyes, close enough to catch the faint scent of cinnamon and coffee that seemed to follow her everywhere. What if there was another option? He said, the words forming as he spoke them. an uncharacteristic lack of calculation that both terrified and exhilarated him. "What do you mean?" "A new agreement," Elliot said, gaining confidence as the idea crystallized. "A partnership." Lucia's eyebrows rose. "Between us? The shark and the cafe girl?" "The businessman and the heart," he corrected. "Your passion, my strategy. Your community focus, my financial acumen." "You want to go into the coffee business?" Lucia asked skeptically. "The mighty Elliot Archer serving lattes?" "Not exactly." Elliot found himself smiling at her characterization, though I've developed a surprising affinity for it. The smile faded as he grew serious. "I'm proposing a community development fund, using Archer Industries' resources to preserve and enhance neighborhood businesses like Sunset Cafe, rather than replacing them." Lucia's expression shifted from confusion to cautious interest. "That's not your usual approach." "No," he agreed. "It's not, but perhaps my usual approach has been missing something essential." "And what would that be?" Elliot hesitated, then chose honesty over careful phrasing. "The human element, the intangible value that can't be captured on a balance sheet." He gestured around the cafe. "What you've built here, what your family built, it matters. Not just to you, but to the fabric of this community." Lucia's eyes widened slightly, genuine surprise registering on her expressive face. "Who are you, and what have you done with Elliot Archer?" "I'm still me," he said quietly. "Just perhaps a more complete version." A charged silence filled the space between them, heavy with unspoken revelations. "This isn't just about the cafe, is it?" Lucia asked softly. Elliot met her gaze directly. "No, it's not." Another crash of thunder, closer now. The storm was directly overhead. 30 days ago, Elliot continued, I saw this cafe as an acquisition target. Nothing more. He paused, gathering courage for a level of honesty he hadn't allowed himself in decades. "But I didn't account for you, Lucia Morales." "Me?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You with your impossible dedication, your refusal to compromise what matters, your ability to see the hungry boy behind the billionaire's armor." Understanding dawned in Lucia's eyes. "The boy from the schoolyard." "Yes." Elliot's admission felt like releasing a breath held for 23 years. "Everything I've built, the empire, the wealth, the power, it was armor. Protection against ever feeling that vulnerable again." "And now?" Lucia asked, her gaze steady on his. "Now I'm standing here, in a cafe I plan to demolish, feeling more vulnerable than I have since that day in the rain," he admitted, a quiet laugh escaping him at the irony. "Because somewhere between balance sheets and bread recipes, between board meetings and broken pipes, I realized something terrifying." "What's that?" Lucia asked, though something in her eyes suggested she already knew. "That you were right from the beginning. Some things are worth more than profit margins. Some connections matter more than strategic advantage." He took a deep breath. "Including this one." He gestured between them, the space charged with possibility. "That almost sounds like a declaration, Mr. Archer," Lucia said, her voice soft but steady. "Perhaps it is." Elliot moved closer, close enough that he could see the pulse fluttering at her throat. "I'm not very practiced at them." "For someone who claims to calculate every move, this seems rather impulsive," she observed but didn't step away. "The most important decisions often are," he replied. "Like a cafe owner refusing to sell to a developer, consequences be damned." A smile tugged at her lips. Touché. Outside, the storm raged, but inside Sunset Cafe, something else entirely was brewing between them. A recognition of what had been building over 30 impossible days. "So what exactly are you proposing, Elliot?" Lucia asked, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "A business partnership? A community fund? Or something else entirely?" "Yes," he said simply. "All of it. Starting with this." He closed, the last distance between them, his hand gently cupping her cheek as his lips found hers. The kiss was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand. Then Lucia's arm slid around his neck, and the kiss deepened into an answer neither of them had anticipated 30 days ago. When they finally parted, slightly breathless, Lucia's smile held a hint of her usual challenge. "That wasn't in our original agreement." "I'm proposing new terms," Elliot replied, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. "More favorable to both parties." Lucia laughed, that warm, genuine sound that had somehow become his favorite over the past month. The great negotiator at work. "Is it working?" he asked, surprising himself with the vulnerability in the question. Instead of answering immediately, Lucia stepped back and walked to the window, watching the rain. Elliot followed, standing beside her as they both gazed out at the storm-washed street. "When I was little," she said after a moment, "my grandmother told me that rain wasn't just water. It was renewal, cleansing, a chance for things to grow in new ways." She turned to face him. "What are you really asking for, Elliot?" "A second chance," he said without hesitation. "Not just for this cafe, or for the development project. For me." He took her hand in his. "The boy in the rain spent 23 years building walls to keep the world out. But somehow, you found your way in anyway." "I'm pretty stubborn that way," she acknowledged with a soft smile. "One of your many qualities I've come to—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Appreciate? Tolerate? Find strategically valuable?" she supplied teasingly. "Love," he finished simply. The word hung between them, unexpected yet inevitable, like their unlikely connection itself. Lucia's eyes widened slightly, then softened with an emotion that made Elliot's heart race. "That's a pretty significant revision to our original terms, Mr. Archer." "Too significant?" he asked, the unfamiliar uncertainty both terrifying and exhilarating. In answer, Lucia rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. A kiss that held promise, challenge, and something wonderfully, terrifyingly real. "I accept your new proposal," she murmured against his lips. "All of it. The partnership, the fund, the something more." She pulled back just enough to meet his gaze. "On one condition." "Name it," he said immediately. "We keep the cafe exactly as it is. Outdated plumbing, inefficient processes, and all the human connections that make it special." Elliot laughed, the sound freer than it had been in decades. "You drive a hard bargain, Ms. Morales." "You have no idea," she replied with a grin. "Just wait until we negotiate breakfast duties." Outside, the rain began to ease, sunlight breaking through in golden shafts that illuminated the cafe in a warm glow. Somewhere in the distance, a rainbow arched across the Manhattan skyline, nature's own symbol of promises after storms. Inside Sunset Cafe, the billionaire known as the Executioner and the determined cafe owner who had changed his world sealed their new agreement with another kiss, one that promised many more to come. 6 months later, "I still can't believe you actually fired the entire board," Lucia said, curled against Elliot on the sofa in his penthouse, financial reports spread across the coffee table before them. "Restructured," he corrected, his arm comfortably around her shoulders. "And only the ones who opposed the community development initiative." She hummed skeptically. "And the fact that Preston called me the gold-digging cafe girl had nothing to do with his immediate departure?" "Pure coincidence," Elliot replied. But the dangerous glint in his eye told a different story. 6 months had transformed both their worlds. The Archer Community Preservation Fund had launched to international acclaim, with Sunset Cafe as its flagship success story. Lucia now divided her time between running the cafe, which had become a destination for both locals and tourists, and directing the fund's neighborhood initiatives. Elliot had faced resistance from traditional shareholders, but had ultimately prevailed by demonstrating that community-focused development could be both profitable and sustainable. The Archer model was being studied in business schools as a new paradigm for ethical urban development. But the most profound transformations had been personal. Lucia had moved into Elliot's penthouse, bringing warmth and laughter to spaces that had once been as cold and impersonal as his corporate offices. Elliot had learned to bake bread from scratch and now insisted on preparing Sunday breakfast himself, much to the astonishment of his household staff. The Rodriguez family's application was approved, Lucia noted, reviewing the fund's latest decisions. Their bakery will be the 11th business saved this quarter, with significant expansion potential, Elliot added. Their pastries rival yours. Lucia gasped in mock offense. Take that back immediately. Instead, Elliot pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. Never. Honesty is our policy, remember? Fine. Their conchas are marginally better than mine, Lucia conceded grudgingly. But my café con leche remains superior. Unquestionably. Elliot gathered the reports into a neat stack. Speaking of the cafe, we should finalize the anniversary celebration details. Already done, Lucia said smugly. Although I'm still not sure about inviting James Harrington. Elliot's expression softened. He should see what we've built. What's possible when profit isn't the only measure of success. Look at you, Lucia marveled, cupping his cheek. The ruthless executioner, now the champion of community values. I had an excellent teacher, he replied, turning to press a kiss to her palm. We both did, Lucia corrected, her expression growing serious. My grandmother used to say that the right person doesn't change who you are. They help you become more fully yourself. Wise woman. Elliot's hand found the small velvet box in his pocket, the one he'd been carrying for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. Perhaps tonight was finally the time. The rain that had been threatening all evening finally began to fall, pattering against the floor-to-ceiling windows. But unlike that day at Westfield Academy, or the stormy afternoon at the cafe 6 months ago, this rain carried no melancholy. It was simply nature's accompaniment to a moment filled with possibility. Do you ever miss it? Lucia asked suddenly. The simplicity of business decisions based purely on profit? The clarity of seeing the world in terms of acquisitions and assets? Elliot considered the question, seriously. Sometimes I miss the certainty, he admitted. The clearly defined metrics of success. And now? He smiled, thinking of the complex, messy, wonderful journey they'd begun together. The challenges they'd faced, the resistance they'd overcome, the communities they'd helped, the lives they'd changed, including, most profoundly, their own. Now I understand that the most valuable things can't be calculated on a spreadsheet, he said, reaching for the box in his pocket. Some investments yield returns that can't be measured in dollars. As the rain created silver patterns on the windows and the city lights twinkled below, Elliot Archer, once the hungry boy in the rain, once the feared executioner, prepared to ask the most important question of his life. Not a business proposition, not a strategic merger, but an invitation to a partnership of the heart. One with terms negotiated not in boardrooms but in shared mornings over coffee, in late-night conversations, in the countless moments of understanding that had transformed two unlikely people into something neither had imagined possible. And as Lucia's eyes widened at the sight of the emerald ring, chosen not for its impressive size but for its color that matched the cafe's vintage espresso machine, Elliot finally understood what she had tried to tell him from the beginning. Some things were worth more than profit margins. Some connections mattered more than strategic advantage. and some people, one person in particular, could transform your entire definition of success. Outside, the rain continued to fall. But this time, it wasn't about humiliation or ending. It was, as Lucia's grandmother had said, about renewal, about cleansing, about the chance for things and people to grow in new and unexpected ways. Together. Elliot Archer, the feared executioner, transformed both his business approach and personal life through his relationship with Lucia. He continues to run Archer Industries, but with a new focus on ethical, community-preserving development. His Archer Community Preservation Fund becomes a model studied at business schools worldwide. The hungry boy from the schoolyard finally finds not just success, but fulfillment, proving that true strength comes not from armor, but from vulnerability and connection. Lucia Morales successfully preserves her grandmother's legacy while expanding its impact through the partnership with Elliot. She divides her time between running the thriving Sunset Cafe and directing the community initiatives of their joint fund. Her business degree finally gets put to full use as she helps other small business owners navigate financial challenges. She brings warmth, authenticity, and perspective to Elliot's world while gaining the security and strategic vision she needed for her own. Sunset Cafe. Rather than being demolished, the cafe becomes a thriving community hub and the model for the Archer Morales approach to urban development. Its success inspires similar preservation efforts across the city, proving that profit and community values can coexist. Brock Warner. After his humiliation at the cafe and subsequent career setbacks, courtesy of Elliot's influence, he attempts to reconnect with Lucia once her relationship with Elliot becomes public. She politely, but firmly declines his sudden interest, suggesting he try the humble pie special at Sunset Cafe. James Harrington. Initially dismissive of Elliot's new business approach, he's forced to recognize its success when his own investment firm begins losing clients to Archer Industries' more ethical practices. At the cafe's anniversary celebration, he finally offers a long-overdue apology for their schoolyard days, one that Elliot, from a place of security rather than vulnerability, is able to genuinely accept. Mrs. Abramowitz and the cafe regulars continue to find community and connection. At Sunset Cafe, now with improved facilities and expanded programs for seniors and low-income residents, funded by premium services for wealthier patrons, a living example of the balanced approach Elliot and Lucia created together. Marcus. Elliot's loyal assistant adapts to his boss's transformation with good-humored support, eventually becoming COO of the Archer Community Preservation Fund and finding his own fulfillment in work that combines profit with purpose. Danny. Lucia's friend and employee becomes the cafe's manager as Lucia takes on broader responsibilities, eventually opening a second location with the cafe's proven community-centered business model. Elena Morales, Lucia's grandmother. Though she appears only in photographs, her legacy lives on not just in the preserved cafe, but in the values she instilled in her granddaughter, values that ultimately transformed not just a neighborhood, but a billionaire's approach to business and life. As Lucia often reminds Elliot, quoting her grandmother's wisdom, "The true measure of success isn't what you build, but who you become while building it."